Welcome back, everybody. It is our weekly What is in the Stack. Sadly, just one guy, not two guys today. Mike's still a little bit busy, but wanted to run through the best new comics of the week, as well as a couple other outliers to talk about some of the major ones that came out this week. And so, couple Marvel, couple DC, kind of run through them. I think the interesting starting point for me is going to be the book that I thought was best this week. And that's Eddie Brock Carnage, number 4. This is Charles Soule, the writer on this one. We've got a fill-in artist on this issue in particular. I'll grab his name, Juan Ramirez. And I have to say, thus far, I think Eddie Brock Carnage has the potential to be the best Marvel comic book series going based on what we've seen in the first 4 issues. And I think there's a couple reasons why this series is working. One, I think, art wise, you do have, you're already on a second creative team. But I do think from an art standpoint, you get some pretty interesting and different art on it, and it fits for a Carnage book. This would not be a great artist for Captain America, Spider-Man, but there is a little bit of more of a gritty feel to the book for through the first 4 issues that I think is really working. The other reason that I think this book is interesting and why I've really enjoyed it for the first 4 issues, Eddie Brock is an interesting character in that the character of Venom is a character that just seemed to be lost. I think Donny Cates did some great things with the character, the introduction of Null, all of that, and then it just spun off into this very weird direction with Al Ewing, with Dylan Brock and all these different multiple timeline Venoms, so many different symbiotes. I think the same thing for Carnage as a character. Carnage is a villain that, look, he has his fans, but he's kind of seemed lost, like there was no point to the character really since like Maximum Carnage, right? He went from this massive threat that was big enough where Spider-Man and Venom have to team up to take him down to just being a function in the Marvel universe, right? He just exists. So I think you have two interesting characters who were kind of lost a bit, stuck, kind of the movie term like developmental hell kind of thing, where it's like both of them just didn't have anywhere to go anymore with what the company had done with them. Venom, I think they've destroyed Venom with their tone with MJV and Venom and all that. I think that's an awful decision. But this idea of taking Eddie Brock and Carnage and kind of doing the spin of like Dexter, where both of them need each other to survive, and essentially to make sure Carnage doesn't kill innocent people, Eddie Brock is finding serial killers. I think that's an interesting take for both characters. And Eddie Brock has always been a character who doesn't truly exist as like a hero in the Marvel universe, but is more noble than your average, villain. I think Carnage being one of the most sadistic kind of characters that exists in Marvel, that sort of interplay, it's a perfect mix for both the characters. And what I think they've done is this interplay between the two characters. We've gotten very used to it in the Venom movies where Eddie and Venom have this kind of banter. The banter between Eddie and Carnage and the differing perspectives that they have and the different ways that they interact with each other throughout the book, I think really works. I think it's really solid and interesting sort of mystery. They set up the first issue, Eddie was on a flight and all the passengers disappear. And that's been kind of a running thing of what happened to that flight, what happened to those passengers. You've got characters like Misty Knight who are investigating what happened because a relative of hers was on the plane. And I just think overall, there's a lot of different layers that are being added to the story that really work. And I think where Charles Soule's doing a really good job. Both Carnage and Eddie have moments where it's a chess match between the two, right? Carnage hides the passengers from Eddie and won't let him know. Eddie in this issue finds a way to get back and get that information. And I think that's a really cool dynamic to have that symbiote relationship truly be an antagonistic relationship again, but one that they also have to mutually help each other. And so I just think a lot of the dynamics that he wove in through the first 4 issues are interesting. I think it's also really no holds barred in terms of it's an action comic. They haven't softened Carnage. They haven't, made it to where the character is like altruistic now, helping people. And I think for Eddie, it's an interesting examination of his character, and that for so long he was just a Spider-Man villain. We've seen a little bit more of a heroic turn that I think took away from the edge of the character. I think this again shows some of his heroism, but also brings it back a little bit of Eddie Brock's a different type of hero. This is not just Peter Parker, with a little bit of edge. This is actually a very different character. And so I think the strengths of this book are really shown well for Marvel. I think it's really interesting because Marvel right now, your major books tend to seem to have more editorial interference. And I think as a result, the books suffer. I think Carnage, very similar to that Sabretooth series that I did a video on earlier this year that I thought was so good, The Dead Don't Talk. I think the interesting thing is, I think because it's a smaller book and it's a smaller character, I actually think they get away just letting the writer truly craft the story a little bit more than they do with other departments. And so I think it's actually working really well. I think this was a great issue. Number 4, it was the best comic that I read this week. I would highly recommend you check it out. Again, can't guarantee it'll be for everybody, but I do think if you want a Marvel book that you can kind of dive into, not a ton that you need to know going in, only a couple issues in. I think it's really strong. I would recommend it. It's been a great book so far. So I would definitely look at that one. Charles Soule as well. I thought he had another great comic book this week. So Daredevil, Cold Day in Hell. Number 2, this is of 3. Steve McNiven's on the art on this. This is very obviously, look, it's the Dark Knight Returns for Daredevil. That's the entire purpose of this book. Um, I do think it's an interesting narrative, and I do think the art overall from McNiven is interesting. You can tell it's a little bit of McNiven. You can see he's trying to bring a little bit of Frank Miller into it as well in his art style, and that like it, you can definitely tell it's McNiven, but there does seem to be kind of a little bit of like a Frank Miller edge. I think even more like a recent Frank Miller, and then I think I can pull one here of Elektra in the book, and it looks very much like McNiven trying to do an approximation of Frank Miller's art, current art. I think where it works is look, the strength of Marvel is their characters, and I think sometimes the modern continuity. I think Daredevil, particularly, has I liked the start of Saladin Ahmed's run. It has really fallen off for me in the last 7 to 10 issues. I think the strength of this is you get to see Daredevil, you get to see Elektra, you get to see Foggy Nelson, you see the characters you know and love. They're put in very disparate circumstances, but I think it's just tying into what you love about those characters. And even though the situation is very weird, you still see the recognizable traits of those characters. Again, shorter series won't be for everybody, but I do think they've hit the nail on the head with the first 2 issues. It'll be interesting to see. Again, the most important part is, can you nail the closing of it? Can you get that job done? But I do think it's really good to see Charles Soule on a couple of books that he's doing really well at. I thought, about maybe 10 years, 12 years ago when he first kind of started out with some of his series, I thought was really, really good and doing a great thing. I thought he did a great run on Daredevil. In the last couple of years, he got kind of bogged down, I think, a lot, like the Star Wars world things, and I just didn't enjoy a lot of the books he was on. I think these are 2 books that really pry into his strengths very well. And so I think both books very interesting, worth checking out. Again, you may not love them, but I do think both are worth reading, worth taking a look at. Different trip to the comic store to pick those up, and it's very different tonally than your major big 2 books, but I think both are worth it. And I think would be interesting for folks to check out. Next couple books I'll go through. Probably the 2 biggest releases of the week. Ultimate Spider-Man number 17 and Batman 160. Both of these books suffer from, I think, the same thing, and that is they're not awful, but I think they're definitely just weird direction things that I think sometimes with comic books they're trying to throw too much at the wall. And so I'll start with Ultimate Spider-Man number 17. I think Ultimate Spider-Man number 17, it's not a bad comic. Messina's on the art, Jonathan Hickman. It's well written, it's well drawn. This is exploring more of the Green Goblin, Harry Osborn faking his death, more of the world of the Mysterio kind of thing that we found out with Gwen Stacy. All of it is okay. It's somewhat interesting. I think it's a game changing kind of thing that they've done. I think the dynamics are kind of cool. However, it's another issue of Ultimate Spider-Man where Peter Parker is nowhere in the pages of this book. And titling a book Spider-Man, it shouldn't be rare that you see Peter Parker in the comic. And we've really seen since issue 12, Peter's been, a very small part of this comic book. And I think that's a huge issue for this, in that I think sometimes Jonathan Hickman is a writer I really love, but I do think occasionally he's so obsessed with the world building element of things that the human touches of make the story great sometimes get pushed to the background. And I think that's what's happening here. And that I don't know how many people were picking up Ultimate Spider-Man going, man, I really want to explore Gwen Stacy as Mysterio. Again, interesting concept. I think it was a cool wrinkle to throw in. Definitely makes it a different universe. But I do think if you're a fan of Spider-Man, it's going to be disappointing. Again, not a bad issue. Nowhere near like, oh, I'm going to drop it. But I do think Ultimate Spider-Man, it seemed like with the Craven arc, they really picked it up and were building up some steam. This was another sort of flat issue, and I think it's a book that's too big and has too much in it to have issues like that. And so while I don't think it's an awful comic book, I do think overall it's just slightly disappointing. I think the same can be said for Batman 160. And look, unquestionably, the book looks amazing. Jim Lee, whatever you want to say about his editorial management, the way that he draws the characters, the way that he draws the world of Batman, Gotham, all of it, it looks fantastic. The thing with this book, I don't think it's awful, but I feel like I missed 6 issues before, is the problem. In that this seems to want to be a sequel to Hush, but it's set a well time after that. Like 20 years have obviously passed since it happened in the real world, but I think in the book, even continuity wise, it's been a while. It's not like they're going, hey, this takes place right after that original run of like Batman 608 through 619. And so while there's a lot of modern continuity stuff in there, because we know, Alfred's dead, Bane killed Alfred, all that kind of stuff, we know those things are still in continuity. The interesting piece is it's acting like so much of the stuff that's happened between Hush and this haven't happened as far as the personality of the characters. And so there's this weird over the top edge that's kind of happened to it. Like Batman is thrown off in a way that he shouldn't be in this book. And I think overall, there just hasn't been enough presence of Hush in the past 10 to 15 years of Batman for the story to really make sense the way it needed it to. I think this is trying to act like nothing has happened since that first Hush. And while I think that's somewhat admirable, if you wanted people who love that story to go, hey, you can just pick this new one up. But there's too much new continuity in it for that to really make sense. And if you've been reading continuity, it doesn't really work because Hush has been off the board and such a non-factor for such a long time. This to me, since I know they're doing 12 issues and this is just the third one, and we got the first 6 this year, and I think the next 6 are next year. I thought the first 6 issues of this really should have been dedicated towards rebuilding Hush, establishing him as a major threat again, maybe a plot that shows he's been involved in a lot more than we thought, or finding a way for him to interestingly take things off the board. Instead, it just kind of seems like everybody changed and we missed that. And I get it when you get Jeff Loeb and you get Jim Lee, you want to give them leeway, you want to let them do what they want to do. I think the book is better than most books simply because of the talent of those two guys. But I think again they've kind of the magic of the first Hush was if you were reading Batman, it still made sense in the continuity, but embraced all the classical elements, the classical villains with obviously the amazing art and this new wrinkle of Hush. This one, it's based in continuity, but not. And so it's kind of, it's similar to like when you watch a movie and you're like, where is this continuity wise? Like when they throw something in the series and you're like, just the events don't add up. And so I don't regret buying it. I think it's still, Jim Lee's art makes it worth the price of admission. But I think it's just an interesting story for them to go with, and that it doesn't seem to have definitively enough to really pull you in as a current fan, or I think there's too much of the current stuff for fans who have checked out for a long time to really feel like, man, I can sink my teeth into it. So I think it's interesting. I think both of those books were disappointing. I think both of them could just use maybe the cooking phrase a little more time in the oven. And I think that's really what it should have been, is this could have used a little more time in the oven as far as these seem to be rushed, and they shouldn't be given the books that are there, and they just didn't seem to be well thought out enough. But would it be interesting? What do you guys think of those 2 books down below? Last 3 or 4 that I'll go through here. Justice League Unlimited #7. This is continuing that We Are Yesterday event. I will say, I think, the strength of Justice League and the strength of this event they've done. Mark Waid as a writer just writes the characters so well that as a reader, you kind of feel like you're seeing the classical versions of all of the characters. And so where I do think Justice League Unlimited has been a success, and I think this issue continues it. And I will say this We Are Yesterday event, I actually like quite a bit. I think there's some interesting wrinkles, seeing the old Legion of Doom characters, seeing, the Justice League, kind of different variations of them stuck in time and things like that. I think the reason that it works is, as a DC Comics fan, I think prior to All In and prior to, the last maybe year or so where DC really seems to have gotten things at least a little bit more on track. The characters just all felt so different. And it felt like when you picked up your average issue of your normal characters, they just didn't feel right. This seems to present Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, all these characters just more like you like to see them. And so I think the interesting thing is using the title Justice League Unlimited. It does feel a little bit more like the cartoon Justice League that we had, and that it's not so bogged down in continuity. It's not so bogged down in making sure you understand the 50 different wrinkles that are happening in all these books. It just seems to be more, hey, if you like DC's classical characters, this is the book for you. And I think that's a great approach for it. I'm not going to say this is like an amazing issue, but I do think if you want a Justice League run to get started with, I think the first 6 or 7 issues of this have really delivered. And I think it really feels in alignment with what Mark Waid's done on Batman and Superman World's Finest, where continuity is not a huge piece of that. It's more just you get to see the characters that you love have a fun adventure, typically well drawn. And I think they're doing a great job with that. Last 2 or 3 here. Superman 26, Josh Williamson's Superman run. I'll be honest, I think this is the DC equivalent of Moon Knight. And when I say that, Moon Knight has been a series that's been running with Jed McKay. I think that series is really, really good, but I don't think it's like remarkable. I don't think you're going to read Moon Knight and be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to remember this comic a decade from now. It's a really reliable, solid comic book each month, right? I kind of compare it to like, it's a good piece of cheese pizza. It's not going to change your life, but you don't regret having it. And I think that's the same thing with Superman with Josh Williamson. I don't think there's anything in that book that's like, man, this is one of the greatest Superman runs of all time. But I do think it's just solidly good enough every month that I always feel like, I got my money's worth out of it and I'm going to pick up the next issue. And I think there is something to that. And then I think we have so many comics now that are on a roller coaster where it's like, man, great issue, crap issue, great issue, crap issue, or just all lows. Where I think having a comic book that's reliable, where it's just like, you know what, I can read Superman, I'm going to see a pretty good representation of the character. I'm going to see the plot wrinkles kind of come together. There's some interesting things thrown in there that make it a little bit different and a little new and fresh, but it's not so different that you're like, man, what are they doing? And so I think overall, that delivered on it. I think it's a good, solid book. I think if you're interested in Superman, I think Williamson's run has just been solid and entertaining. And I think it's really cool to see DC while I haven't loved Absolute Superman, the Summer of Superman thing they're doing, I'm all for it. And I love to see that character getting the spotlight as he should. And I think they're really putting some things together that could work. So it was solid Superman storytelling from Josh Williamson. Last 2 books, I'll talk about Absolute Universe stuff. This is the main corner of DC. I've still been following kind of as many of the books as I can. I dropped Absolute Green Lantern, just wasn't the book for me. These ones I'm still on. Absolute Wonder Woman is very interesting in that it's the start of a new story arc. It reminded me a lot of Ultimate Spider-Man this week. This is a boring issue. And I think again, when we're 8 issues in, when you have a book and you put, new story arc starts here and all this stuff, you would expect just a little splash, a little something to be like, man, that was good, especially for a $5 price. And so while I don't think this is a poor comic book, I think it was hard to see the art shift back to Hayden Sherman, and that I think he's got his place. I just don't think this is a great book for him. I think they had a fill-in artist. I'm trying to remember the last 2, and the book just looked immaculate. And it was so well drawn, and it was more mythical, and it really seemed to tie into the gods and Amazons, and all that's the interesting piece of Wonder Woman. This again, it's not bad, but the art is just a little bit flat. The pacing was a little bit slow. Again, I'm not going to drop the book, but this is a step in the wrong direction, in my opinion. In that, again, 8 issues in, you can't start acting like you're a comic that's had years and years of goodwill behind it. I think any book that's younger than 12 issues really has to bring it on every issue. And this just felt slow, the filler, a filler issue. And when you put something out there about, hey, new story arc starts here and all this stuff, there should have been something like a major hook to make you go like, man, I want to see what comes next. And while there's a little bit of that, it just doesn't deliver enough. Again, I'll keep reading because I want to see the potential of these absolute books come together. But I will say that's the first issue I've read of that where I was just, I don't really know what I read. And in all honesty, I had to flip through it again before I started talking about it to even remember what happened in the book because it was just so forgettable. And I'm not buying like 50 comic books, I buy like 6 or 7 a week. And so when you buy it in a book, like you struggle to remember it 15 minutes later, you really have to do something, especially with a book being only 7 or 8 issues in. I think the opposite problem is what Martian Manhunter #3, Absolute Martian Manhunter, has in it, Look, you will remember this comic. It is incredibly colorful. It is different than most of what is happening throughout Marvel and DC. It's a different looking book. I will say with this again, there's a difference between a book that's doing something different and something that just seems to be intentionally obscure. And so my issue with Absolute Martian Manhunter is, while I think the dynamic of kind of splitting the Martian Manhunter and John Jones into two characters, and you're seeing a little bit of the struggles that's causing John Jones in his real life, it's interesting, but again, it's gotta be so well done for a book to really grab you. And I think three issues in, this again kind of felt a little slow. And I think the problem that you have is, while I still like this book and I'm in for at least the first six issues of it, I do admire the way that it looks different, and I admire the fact that it's a memorable book. But I just think again that these comic books in the Absolute Universe, I think they're starting to take for granted that, like, you need to still grab the reader. I think one of the things I give Absolute Batman is each issue of Absolute Batman, with the exception of maybe one, I think like issue four, which was like an origin story, there's something memorable. It's action packed. There's something where if you're a reader, it feels like Scott Snyder is putting something together, like a great action movie where it's like, hey man, from page one to page 20 something, whatever it ends at, you feel like engrossed in that story. These, there's a lot of decompression, a lot of talking, a lot of stuff where it's just not interesting enough character wise that you're like, oh man, I really like that character, but not enough action that it grabs you where it's like, man, that was fun. And I think they got to figure that out, because once a series gets to issue 24, 25, something like that, you can start slowing down a bit and really kind of having, hey, we've got readership buy-in, people love this, you can do a little bit more of those decompression issues. These series are so young and so few issues in, that to have already where it's kind of like, hey, let's have a month where we ramp things down a little bit, it just feels like a mistake. And so, while I won't say that they're awful comic books or bad, I'm not going to say, oh, the writers suck or anything dramatic. I just think it's a weird step in the wrong direction. And I think both of those books, and I think Ultimate Spider-Man's in the same place. You need to ramp it up a bit. You need to put it back where there's major events and stakes that's happening. Because sometimes I think they're just so obsessed with the world building. It's like, you might build a world that we can jump out of a year in because you didn't do a good enough job of. It's one thing to make us care about the world that's there, but you build up a world that no one cares about. Who really is going to be invested? And I think that's the risk they're running on those titles. But that's the week for me. So I think Absolute Carnage, definitely worth checking out. Daredevil Cold Day in Hell, definitely worth checking out. I would tentatively say that I think the Jim Lee art is good enough that you should still check out Batman, and I think Superman 26 was pretty good as well. But would be interesting again. What are your guys' thoughts down below? Let me know what was in your stack for the week. If there's anything I missed or anything you think that's worth checking out, let me know down below. As always, folks, thanks for watching. God bless you. Catch you in the next video.